The CCP is not only exerting high pressure on Taiwan, but is also in conflict with the Philippines in the South China Sea. As China finds itself in a rapidly changing environment both internally and externally, a major internal upheaval seems to be on its way. Tensions in the South China Sea have escalated in recent weeks as China and the Philippines become embroiled in a series of disputes over territories over which they both claim sovereignty. Under the U.S. Philippines military alliance, the U.S. will come to the defense of the Philippines in the event of a serious confrontation between the Philippines and other countries in the disputed waters of the South China Sea. In other words, if the CCP provokes trouble in the South China Sea, it will start a world-class war. Someone has described the China-Philippines brush-off on October 4th as bringing the world within 1 meter of a major war.
The closest dangerous maneuver that we ever had for the passive supply was also done in this particular operation at a distance of only 1 meter. No? China Coast Guard vessel 21556 carried out a dangerous maneuver to BRP Sendangan at a distance of 1 meter, which forced the commanding officer to stop its engine and to reverse its engine.
On October 4th, Philippine vessels once again delivered supplies to the old Navy transport ship, the BRP Sierra Madre, which the Philippines grounded on the shoal in 1999 to reinforce its sovereignty claim. China deployed Coast Guard and militia vessels to surround the Philippine patrol boat and 2 Philippine merchant ships. The standoff lasted about 8 hours. The Philippine patrol boat was almost hit by a Chinese Coast Guard vessel. The distance between them was only 1 meter. Fortunately, the Philippine patrol boat quickly reversed its engines, and the 2 Philippine merchant ships, being smaller in size, managed to break through the siege and complete the logistics supply to the Renai Reef.
We condemn the behavior of the Chinese Coast Guard vessel. They have been violating the international law, particularly the collision regulations, since they have carried out dangerous maneuver and blocking operations to the Philippine Coast Guard to prevent our routine operation in providing supply for our military troops.
Renai Reef is a disputed reef between China and the Philippines. The Philippines anchored an old landing ship here that's guarded by 7 Philippine Marines. The ship is regularly refilled and fortified. Beijing has been interfering from time to time. The threat is made through a blockade of warships, vessels, and the airspace. It's to prevent Philippine vessels from approaching the Renai Reef and providing supplies. If China succeeded, the Marines on the stranded warship would have to leave due to a lack of food or water. As such, the Renai Reef conflict has become the most irritating issue in the current Sino-Philippine relations, especially in 2023. On August 5th, China fired high-pressure water cannons at Philippine vessels to prevent supplies from being delivered. The Chinese Coast Guard said 2 Philippine supply ships and 2 Marine Police vessels entered the waters near the shoal without permission from the Chinese government. A video released by the Philippine Coast Guard showed several Chinese vessels surrounding the Philippine Coast Guard vessel. The Chinese side used high-pressure water cannons. China and the Philippines have a long-standing territorial dispute in the South China Sea. According to the law of the sea, the neighboring countries in the South China Sea are entitled to 12 nautical miles of territorial waters and 200 nautical miles to establish an exclusive economic zone. Renai Reef is within the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone of the Philippines and is therefore considered by the Philippines to be under its sovereignty.
In accordance with international and Philippine national laws, we are proceeding according to our planned route. Request to stay clear from our passage.
The recent conflict between China and the Philippines and the South China Sea involves not only Renai Reef but also Huangyang Island. Huangyang Island, also known as Scarborough Shoal, is 124 miles from the Philippines. It's a location with strategic significance. On September 24, 2023, the Chinese Coast Guard set up a 300-meter-long buoyed barrier near Scarborough Shoal. The buoys were subsequently cut off by the Philippine Coast Guard. The Philippines blasted China, saying that it shouldn't have set up floating barriers on Huangyang Island, which has always been a traditional fishing ground of Filipino fishermen. In an interview with CNN on September 29th, the Philippine Defense Secretary said, "I can't think of a more obvious case of bullying. It's not just a matter of stealing your lunch money, it's a matter of stealing your lunch box, your chair, and even keeping you out of school. On the same day, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. also said that his country will stand firm in defending its territory and the rights of its fishermen. Fishermen in the coastal town of Zambales were baffled by the floating barriers set up by the CCP in the Scarborough Shoal. They questioned why China was preventing fishermen from entering the area, which is 100 miles from the Philippines and 500 miles from China.
Malapit ito sa atin sa Pilipinas ang ano.
The Scarborough Shoal, is closer to the Philippines, just around 100 to 150 miles, while it's around 500 miles from China. Why are they stopping us from entering? There should be an agreement between the Philippines and China. Why are we being barred from entering our territory when we're from the Philippines? When I saw what they did in reports, it's very dangerous. They use thick ropes and chains tied to buoys. If the smaller boats ran into those, they could get into serious accidents. Those barriers should be removed. That's the best thing to do so our fellow fishermen can properly fish. In a statement released on its official website, China Coast Guard said that on September 22nd, a vessel of the Philippine Bureau of Fisheries and Aquaculture had illegally entered the waters adjacent to Huangyan Island without the approval of the Chinese government, causing trouble and provoking disputes. China Coast Guard responded in accordance with the law and effectively controlled the incident through verbal warnings, route control, and other necessary measures. It also temporarily set up floating barriers to prevent the Filipino vessel from attempting to intrude into Huangyan Island. On September 25th, the Philippine Coast Guard conducted a special operation by entering the shoals on a small motorboat and diving in with snorkels and masks to cut through barriers and remove anchors. The Coast Guard said the mission, which was approved by the President, demonstrated their determination to assert their presence in the shallows. On September 27th, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs protested against the Philippines' actions at a press conference, claiming that Huangyan Island was an inherent Chinese territory over which China had undisputed sovereignty. Huangyan Island is an inherent part of China's territory, and China has indisputable sovereignty over Huangyan Island and its adjacent waters, as well as sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant sea areas. On September 22nd, a Philippine fishing vessel entered the waters near Huangyan Island without China's permission and attempted to ram into the lagoon of Huangyan Island. Chinese Coast Guard vessels took necessary measures in accordance with the law to intercept and expel the Philippine vessel, and the operation was conducted professionally and with restraint. Huangyan Island is China's inherent territory, and the so-called actions of the Philippine side are purely self-indulgent drama. China will continue to safeguard the territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests of Huangyan Island. The so-called statement made by the Philippine side is nothing but its own allegation. China firmly upholds the sovereignty and the maritime rights and interests of Huangyan Island, and we advise the Philippines not to make provocations and make troubles. The CCP claims sovereignty over the entire South China Sea and seized control of Huangyan Island from the Philippines in 2012. Since then, the Chinese have deployed marine police and other vessels to prevent or restrict Filipinos from accessing the fishery. Yet, the Philippines has been fishing there for generations. In 2013, the Philippines submitted Huangyan Island, along with other South China Sea disputes, to the Permanent Court of International Arbitration, PCIA, in The Hague. It ruled in 2016 that China's claim to sovereignty over the 9-dash line in the South China Sea was invalid. The 9-dash line covers 90% of the South China Sea and cuts into the exclusive economic zones of Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Beijing, however, has refused to recognize the results of the 2016 arbitration. Based on our observations, the recent heated clashes between China and the Philippines and the South China Sea aren't what the CCP expected. On June 30th, 2022, Marcos Jr. became president of the Philippines. At first, the CCP had great expectations for him. The inauguration ceremony was attended by the then Vice President of China. At the beginning of 2023, Marcos Jr. made a state visit to China. It was not only the first official visit of Marcos Jr. outside of ASEAN, but also the first foreign leader China received in the year. The two sides signed 14 cooperation documents, and the Philippines received investment commitments of more than U.S. $20 billion from China. The two foreign ministries also set up a direct communication channel to avoid misjudgments and miscommunication. At that time, the CCP believed that Sino-Philippine relations had entered a new phase. The Chinese ambassador to the Philippines called it the beginning of a new golden age of Sino-Philippine relations. But Renai Reef has ignited a series of conflicts. Since February 2023, it feels like an unseen hand has been driving one conflict after another in the region. There seems to be no way to stop or end them. For example, on April 23, 2023, on the eve of Marcos Jr.'s visit to the U.S., several media outlets were invited to board a Philippine Coast Guard ship to see it patrolling in the South China Sea. When it approached Renai Reef, a Chinese Coast Guard ship suddenly cut across the path, with only 50 yards separating the two sides, which was extremely dangerous. The Philippine patrol boat was forced to change direction and switch off its engine. The incident was widely reported by the international media and made Beijing's reputation in the world even worse. As we can see, when Marcos Jr. came to power in 2022, he adjusted his policy and pursued enemy-free diplomacy, relying on the U.S. on the one hand and trying to maintain a balance between China and the U.S. on the other. Therefore, in 2023, Marcos Jr. visited China in January and the U.S. in May, opened 4 new military bases to the U.S. military in February, and at the same time assured Beijing that the military bases wouldn't be used for offensive operations. The Philippine side has repeatedly stated that the relationship between the Philippines and China includes more than just differences over the South China Sea. The CCP, for its part, has followed its past behavior and isn't able to make a mid-course change. It's unhappy that the Philippines is walking a tightrope between China and the US, and it's also very annoyed that the Philippines has added 4 more military bases, believing that the additional bases will significantly enhance the U.S. military's ability to respond to a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. Thus, it'll deter it from using force against Taiwan. The CCP seems to want to teach the Philippines a lesson and thus target the Renai Reef, which has been the scene of many conflicts this year. What the CCP didn't realize is that it has obviously misjudged the national sentiment of Marcos Jr. and the Philippines. Compared to the CCP, the Philippines is weak. Nonetheless, it has chosen not to back down from the CCP's increasing aggression anymore. Unlike the former president, Marcos Jr. has seized the olive branch handed over by the Biden administration to strengthen the Philippine-U.S. alliance. And he isn't afraid of the conflict over the Renai Reef, but responded calmly with resilient resistance. Earlier, in May 2023, as the Philippine president visited the White House for the first time in 11 years, Marcos Jr. received a clear security commitment from the U.S. For the first time, the U.S. and the Philippines published the Bilateral Defense Guidelines, which examine threats in various areas and the forms of responses to them, with particular reference to attacks in the disputed South China Sea, including attacks against the Philippine Coast Guard. In addition, U.S. Philippine military drills continue, and there are plans to resume joint U.S. Philippine patrols in the South China Sea. For example, on October 2nd, the U.S. and the Philippines began a 2-week joint naval drill in Philippine waters as a show of force, with the participation of forces from the UK, Canada, and Japan, as well as observers and experts from the Australian, French, Indonesian, and New Zealand navies. In the face of a series of recent confrontations between China and the Philippines, U.S. officials have warned that the U.S. has an obligation to defend the Philippines, including in the South China Sea, if Philippine troops, aircraft, and ships are subjected to an armed attack.
Recommendations to our senior leaders for the consideration of additional sites, but there's still work to do there before we get to that answer.
The deepening of the Philippine-U.S. alliance has given the Philippines more confidence in facing the CCP. For example, in August 2023, the Philippines announced that it had suspended the Manila Bay Reclamation Project undertaken by Chinese enterprises. On August 15th, the Philippines released a national security policy document, making it clear to the CCP that conflict in the Taiwan Strait is a major concern for the Philippines.
Now there's an additional aspect to it, and that is whilst the tensions across the Taiwan Straits seem to be continuing to increase, then the safety of our Filipino nationals in Taiwan becomes of primordial importance. And so that these EDCA sites will also prove to be useful for us should that terrible occurrence come about. And so, again, it's all we have a very defensive posture.
It's clear that the CCP's use of the Renai Reef conflict to hammer the Philippines is foolish. This move has pushed the Philippines, which is trying to be neutral, towards the U.S. without a doubt. The CCP has set up military bases on many islands in the South China Sea. They enable the CCP to control the entire South China Sea. During normal times, they pose a threat to neighboring countries, and in the event of a major incident or war, they can easily seal off the entire South China Sea. So, they are strategically significant. The CCP's aggressive attitude is not only about competing for economic interests, but also about its political and military agendas. The South China Sea has always been regarded as rich in oil and gas reserves and fishery resources. In the 1970s in particular, the discovery of rich oil reserves in the waters of the South China Sea triggered an even more intense battle for territorial sovereignty. Brunei, China, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam have all claimed parts of the South China Sea as their own. Let's look at it from a number of perspectives. The South China Sea has oil reserves of about 23 to 30 billion tons, accounting for about 12% of global reserves, 33% of China's total oil resources. More than 100,000 ships sail through the South China Sea every year. The goods carried through the South China Sea account for about 25% of the global seaborne trade, which is an important international waterway. The South China Sea accounts for 10% of the world's fishery resources and 25% of Asia's total fish catch. What the CCP didn't expect was that bad luck would come in droves in just a few years. Whether it's a war in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea, if it broke out, it wouldn't be a regional war. The outcome for China in a war would be worrying. While the CCP is posturing as a war wolf, neither its military nor the Chinese people want to go to war. China's military is undergoing a major shakeup, which is a revealing sign. At the same time, China's economy is in a downward spiral. It has caused public resentment and a wave of anti-party sentiment. The combination of these factors means that a major change is coming to China soon. It's like a huge internal explosion. What we witness is a slow-motion display of the events leading up to this violent explosion.